Myths of the Dogman by David Gordon White. Chapter 5. Dog Cookers and Other Borderline Cases in Ancient and Medieval India. 1. Miscegenation and Exile. The myths of the Visvamitra cycle constitute one explanation for the origins and existence of the fallen or exiled races of dog cookers on the periphery of society and the borderline of human categories. There is, however, an alternative explanation, one that is found in both the didactic epic and the law books of the beginning of the Common Era. This is the ideology of damnation through miscegenation, or, more properly, through the mixing of castes, the blurring of categories between castes in its most extreme form. But here, rather than a Rishi's curse, it is the impersonal workings of cosmic order and fate that strike down recalcitrant humans. The crime is much graver than a mere flouting of occupational categories, as it involves the dangerous mixing of incompatible body fluids across caste lines. The miscegenator and his or her offspring dwell in a perpetual state of exile from the body politic. More than this, they are exiled from organized space and time as well. Their sexual crime, according to the orthodox ideology, condemns them to live in an undefined wilderness and under perpetual yogic twilight. The genealogies of these fallen races is developed with obsessive meticulousness in the Mahabharata and the law books. Thus we find a Brahmin woman and a Sudra gave rise to a Kandala, the fierce killer of criminals who lives on the outside. From the Kandalas spring a race called the Svapakas, who are guardians of the dead. From the Sudra spring, in the inverse order, 3 low-born sons, the Ayogava, the Kasadar, and the Kandala, the lowest of men. One born from a Kasadar man and a Yugra woman is called a Svapaka. The Mahabharata also offers various alternative cycles of rebirths into which high caste persons may fall through their evil acts. If the individual falls to an animal level of existence, the dog is generally his last subhuman incarnation, or the Svapaka his first human incarnation. So, for example, a sinner is reborn first as a worm, then a hedgehog, mongoose, boar, deer, bird, Svapaka, Sudra, Vaisya, and finally a Kshatriya. The transmigratory fall is sometimes dramatized in the epic. A Kandala, whose body is smeared with the dust raised by dogs and asses, had, in a past life, eaten food sprinkled with the milk from the stolen cows of a Brahmin. The dog that accompanies him had also been a human in his past life, and is presumably fallen for the same reason as his master. If one merely falls to a lower human level, rebirth is usually as some sort of outcast. Thus, a Brahmin pupil who humiliates his teacher is reborn as a Svapaka or a Pulkasa. In the cycle of rebirths, the body into which a transmigrating soul is born in a given existence is one's due on the basis of the sum total of one's past deeds or karma with respect to dharma. Svapaka wombs exist in a given number in order that those souls, even those of Brahmins, as well as we have seen, who so merit it may suffer a base existence during which, if they follow their svadharma, they may so improve their karma as to gradually climb the ladder of rebirths up to the noble higher castes. The ideology of which these aphorisms, lists, and fables were expressions was perhaps not intended to be racist or jingoist. It was merely implicit to an elitist worldview. It was also hypocritical, for the so-called outcast is as caught up in the social network of reciprocity and interdependence as is the Brahmin. Even as they are excluded from society, the outcasts have their social functions to fulfill, without which the higher castes would not be able to maintain their ritual purity and distance from them. They have been, since time immemorial, the garbage men of India, carrying off all that is dead or left over. This includes the removal of refuse and excrements from streets and dwellings. The slaughter and disposal of the remains of the dead animals, and the preparation of funeral pyres. Their situation and duties, dramatized in our core myth, are set out in legalist terms in the Manu Smriti. The dwellings of the Kandalas and Svapakas shall be outside the village. They shall be made to eat from separate or broken vessels, and their wealth shall consist of dogs and asses. The clothes of dead bodies shall be their dress. Their ornaments shall be of iron, and they shall be constantly wandering. One who follows the law shall not seek intercourse with them. They shall not wander about in villages or cities during the night. They shall carry out corpses of people without relations. They shall always execute criminals, and they shall dispose of the clothes, beds, and ornaments of those executed. Elsewhere, the dog cooker and dog are grouped together as recipients of the Vaisvadeva sacrifice, in which the householder throws food out upon the ground twice daily. 2. The atmosphere, a vertical wilderness. Dog cookers are relegated to the outer periphery of towns in the law books, and to the unordered utopian wilderness in mythic sources. In the latter texts, myths of Vaisvamitra end with that Raja Rishi elevating Matanga, Trisanku, and Hariskandra to an atmospheric, though not a celestial, plane. As in the myths of Sunasipa, there is an astronomical motif underlying these myths, but this is overshadowed by the ideological, caste-oriented purport of the Visvamitra cycle. In these myths, the ambiguous Visvamitra apparently elevates Svapakas to a spatial locus higher than that of Brahmins on earth. This elevation constitutes a kind of liberation from the enslaving network of servile duties to which these people are otherwise condemned. As a mythological change in status, it parallels, to some extent, that of the cynocephalic abominable in medieval Christian traditions. While Visvamitra is unable to raise these persons to heaven or to moksha, liberation, he seems to improve their lot in a tangible way. From another perspective, however, the atmospheric rise of the dog cookers is nothing but an insidious reassertion of the old order, a sort of mythological equivalent to public housing projects. The atmospheric level to which degraded dog cookers accede is a mythological halfway house that, in certain respects, is nothing more than a locus that is as vertically excluded as had been their earthly locus on a horizontal plane. Just as the dog cookers' forest haunts or peripheral location on the confines of town were undefined zones located between the ordered mandala of one town or hermitage and another, so their new atmospheric haunts is the relatively undefined zone that falls by default between heaven and earth. The atmosphere, like the wild forest, is a place of transition and motion, and is the realm of the wind and of atmospheric or meteorological phenomena. These latter are deified in Indra, who, it will be recalled, instructed the wandering Rohita to move in the Sunasipa myth. We have already seen that the undefined forest zone is the haunt of Svapakas and their ilk. It is also that of a dread class of wild animals, the Svapadas, or the dog-footed creatures. This juxtaposition of atmosphere, wild forest, and things canine goes further. Sarama, the divine bitch and companion to Indra, is also associated with the wind. So too are the monkey god Hanuman and the wild lupine Mahabharata hero Bhima Virkodara, who is an incarnation of Vayu. When the Kandalas are first mentioned in the Purusa Meda, human sacrifice rite, of the Yajur Veda, they are offered to Vayu. On the earthly plane, it is only the individual who ventures into the wild forest who is likely to happen upon Svapakas and Svapedas. Such individuals may be divided into two major classes: the royal hunter, who pursues game together with his retinue and hunting dogs; the wandering ascetic, who quite often has a dog for his sole companion. In the king's case, the wilderness is more than a hunting ground. Each of his forays into it is a conquest of wild nature and an expansion of the mandala of his rule. In fact, Mythic accounts of such expeditions were generally descriptions of a form of royal ordeal that symbolized, especially when it concluded with the establishment of a royal shrine, a cosmification of chaos. This is reflected in the narrative replete with canine symbolism in the Mahavamsa account of the coming of Buddhism to Ceylon. Prince Vijaya lands on Lanka on the same day that the Buddha enters into parinirvana. Soon after his arrival, there appears in the form of a bitch, a Yakini, who is an attendant of the great Yakini, Kuvana. One of Vijaya's men follows after her, thinking, "Only where there is a village are dogs to be found." He finds Kuvana sitting at the foot of a tree, spinning, as would a woman hermit. She captures the man and binds him with her magical powers. But because of the power of the magic thread he wears, she cannot devour him. She then throws the man and 700 of his soldiers into a chasm. Vijaya comes searching for his men and immediately recognizes Kuvana to be a Yakini. He rushes at her and throws a noose over her neck, crying, "Slave, give me back my men or I slay thee." She frees his men, and Vijaya and Kuvana sup together. She then transforms herself into a beautiful 16-year-old maiden, and, making a bed at the foot of the tree, invites Vijaya to lie with her. And seeing this, the king's son Vijaya, looking forward to the time to come, takes her to him as his spouse, and lies with her blissfully upon that bed. Vijaya hears singing in the night, and is told by Kuvana that these are the Yakas who rule the island, and that their capital city of Sisirvathu is close at hand. Vijaya slays all the Yakas, and himself puts on the garments of the Yaka king. The wilderness, as a locus of unordered movement, as opposed to the stasis of the royal capital, or the Brahmin's hermitage, a spatial non-definition, is inhabited by such non-beings as the Kandala or Svapaka peoples, or the Indian Dryads or Sileni, the Yaksas or Yakas in Pali. While the Yaksas could be and were domesticated and civilized in myths like this one, the Svapakas were, conversely, tamed without ever being socialized on the mythological or ideological level. The dog cooker does come to work within the social sphere, and even to live on its confines. As such, he is the archetypal migrant worker, serving the inhabitants of the town, even as he is excluded from social intercourse with them. And, as we have seen, even when the Anti-Vasayan is saved from his exclusion, it is only so that he may be shunted to another excluded level, this time the atmosphere. As for the wandering ascetic, his rapport with the wilderness-dwelling Antyajas is generally more cordial than that of the king and his orthodox colleagues, and from time to time, we even find the renouncer sharing prohibited food with his black dog cooker friends, while the sun sets on yet another cosmic age. What makes the forest the place of the renouncer, apart from the obvious fact that it is a good place in which to be antisocial? Symbolically, the forest, as a zone without boundaries or limitations, can in the renunciant ideology evoke liberation from the bonds of society and existence, and thus from rebirth. Viewed as chaos or living hell by those engaged in the ordered existence of the center, the forest represents freedom for the renouncer. The wind of the intermediate regions is, in fact, of paramount importance to the ascetic. This we find as early as the Vedic hymn of the Kesson, who flies with the winds. Mastery of the breaths is fundamental to yoga, the highest form of Indian asceticism. Here, breath control leads to perfect stasis, even to end-stasis, which in turn reverses the entropic process of aging and decay and affords great powers by which the yogin becomes master of the natural universe. This combination of a transient lifestyle with a particular attention to the volatile element wind earned for these antisocial iconoclasts the symbolic place that they came to inhabit in common with the nameless masses that society rejected. For, in the eyes of society, the yogic renouncer too was another within, whose perverse existence troubled the orthodox order of things. This is illustrated time and time again in the mythology of Visvamitra. 3. Antisocial motion and movements in the Vedic period. The 6th century Bharat Samhita of Varahamihira, though it is mainly devoted to astrology, astronomy, and portents, is valuable in the implicit associations it makes between a certain class of humans and dogs. Thus we read at the beginning of the section entitled, The Circle of Dogs. If a dog urinates on a man, horse, elephant, pot, saddle, milky tree, pile of bricks, parasol, pallet, seat, mortar, standard, cowrie, or a flowery or grassy site, and then goes in front of a traveler, then the traveler's undertaking, will be successful. If it urinates on moist cow dung, sweet foods will come to him. If on dry cow dung, then dried grain, molasses or sweets will be obtained. Again, if the dog urinates on or kicks a poisonous or thorny tree, firewood, a stone, a dried up tree trunk, or the bones of a cremation ground, and goes ahead of the traveler, this portends undesirable events. Urinating on a bed of pottery vessels that are broken or intact means a blemish will befall the daughters of the traveler's house. On vessels as well as sandals in use, the pollution of the woman of the house. By urinating on a cow, a dog portends miscegenation with an outcast. This section continues with further omens, generally favorable, regarding the behavior of the dog vis-a-vis the traveler. Thereafter, however, follows a long series of portents relating to dogs in houses and towns that are, with few exceptions, extremely inauspicious. A few points are worth immediate note in this text. First, the urinating dog is associated with a person who is defined by movement. This is the yatir or yayin, the traveler. Second, there is a clear distinction made between omens issuing from the dog's passage through 1. What is clearly an auspicious outside setting, milky tree, such as the tamed forest or hermitage. 2. An inauspicious outside setting, a poisonous tree, such as the wilderness or the world at the end of an age. And 3. The ordered inside space of the household. In the first outside case, all the omens are auspicious. In the third, in which the dog urinates on household items, and finally on a family cow, the results are extremely dire. The soiler of the woman of the house, and ultimately miscegenation with an outcast. The symbolism of a dangerous mixing of categories is transparent here. Canine excrements mixed with human eating vessels, and with the source of pure Brahmin food, the cow, is catastrophic. In the reigning ideology, dog and cow, outcast and Brahmin, excrement and food, are polar opposites that are to be strictly segregated in every respect. Varahamihira also makes a telling remark with regard to the cosmic place of foreigners and dog cookers in the social microcosm. The corners of towns, villages, and houses are attended with evils for those who abide there. But persons of the lowest tribes, the Svapakas and so on, will prosper in them. This passage echoes the Manusmriti's legalistic relegation of the outcast to the periphery of towns. It also reproduces a certain Indian view of the cosmos as a circle whose circumference touches the sides of a square at the 4 cardinal points. The outside is constituted by the 4 corners outside the circle's circumference. Let us turn now to the traveler of these omens, as it is he who corresponds to the errant ascetic of the wilderness. Both of the terms employed for him in Varahamihira's text are participial forms derived from ya, to go. As such, both his names and canine associations evoke earlier and later avatars of the same phenomenon. Among the Vedic gods, it is Indra, together with Rudra, whom we will discuss shortly, who is most closely and frequently associated with various groups of wandering ascetics. One of these is known as the Yatis, from ya, to go, or from yat, to strive. The Yatis have a checkered career in Brahmanic literature. They are referred to in the Atharva Veda and the Asvalayana Srauta Sutra, without censure. In later Brahmanic sources, however, It is related that Indra was once barred from a Soma sacrifice for the threefold sin of having killed Vritra, mistreated Visvarupa, and thrown the Arormagas, or Yatis, to the Salavarakas, literally house wolves. Commentaries on these sources identify the Yatis with non-Aryan peoples, anti-Brahmanical sects, and evil renouncers. Yet, the Mahabharata states that the virtuous Sudra, Vidura, practiced Yati Dharma, errant asceticism, up to the end of his life. Another group, whose name indicates a wandering existence, are the Yatus, also derived from Ya, to go. In the Vedas, Yatu and Yatudana are both generic terms for sorcerers, and both are associated with dogs. In the Rig Veda and the Atharva Veda, we find references to Indra, who combats Svayatis, dog sorcerers, or sorcerers having the forms of dogs. Indra is, as we have seen, closely associated with dogs and dog cookers in other sources. Apart from adopting a wandering ascetic's garb in the Sunasipa legend in which a boy with a canine name is to be sacrificed, it is Indra who receives, in the Rig Veda, a sacrifice that includes 100 black dogs. The same Indra is said to have offered a dog as sacrificial victim in a time of distress. Indra, the god of the intermediate atmosphere, in fact participates in nearly every Brahmanic myth in which dogs come into play. He is the ally of the Richisvan, the Matarisvan, and the rival of the Kalaganja demons, of which 2 become dogs. Most importantly, Indra is, in the Vedic period, the master, when he is not her son, of the divine bitch Sarama, the mother of Yama's 2 hellhounds, the Saramayo. Also in the Vedas, Indra slays the leader of the Yatumatis, a generic term for sorceress, a group whose name Sayana glosses with the term Yatudana. Indra and a witch named Yatudani are brought together in the didactic portion of the epic. In another obscure myth set during a drought between 2 cosmic ages, a Sudra named Pasusaka, the friend of beasts, marries a girl named Ganda, dirty, and they work as servants for the 7 rishis, who have nothing to eat in a time of famine. In a previous time, King Saiba Varishya Darbi had offered his son to the rishis as a sacrificial present. Now the young prince has died, and the rishis have cooked his body with the intention of eating it. King Varishya Darbi appears and offers them cows and wealth if they will eschew eating the flesh of his son. An argument ensues, which results in the rishis leaving the boy's body uneaten. An angry Varishya Darbi then creates an ogress named Yatudani and instructs her to slay the rishis. The 7 rishis come upon a beggar named Sunasaka, the friend of dogs, who, very fat and well-fed, is wandering about with a dog. Seeing him, Vasistha says, "The sacred fire of this one is not like ours. It is for this reason that we both see him and his dog so well developed." They come to a lake haunted by Yatudani, who will only permit them to harvest its lotus filaments for food after they have given her an etymological explanation for their names. This they all give, until it is Sunasaka's turn. Saying that he is incapable of explaining his name, he strikes her with his triple stick, reducing her to ashes. The rishis then harvest the lotus filaments, but discover after a time that a portion of them is missing. They all pronounce a curse upon the thief, except Sunasaka, who blesses him. Sunasaka then reveals himself to be the thief, and reveals as well that he is Indra, who has come to earth to destroy Yatudani. After this, he causes the 7 rishis to ascend to heaven, where they are visible as Ursa Major. The late and often corrupt Skanda Purana relates the same story, but in this version, Indra, the foreigner whose sacred fire is not like ours, is disguised as Sunomukha, Dogface. Among mythical creatures, it is most often the Asuras who are portrayed in literary references or in art as being animal-faced, and certain of these are clearly dog-headed. Among Shiva's Gana hordes, which are also composed of various nocturnal or demonic creatures, there are some who are cynocephalic. We will discuss India's rare references to foreign cynocephalic humans in the following chapter. Myths concerning Indra's interaction with these various goers of the wilderness, especially that of Sunhasaka, appear obscure at first. A recent work by the German Indologist Harry Falk, Bruderschaft und Feldspiel, casts these, however, in a new interpretive light. Falk's work is primarily a discussion of the connection between ritual dice play in ancient India and a group known as the Varatyas. I have treated the first element of Falk's thesis in an earlier work, and will therefore not touch upon it here. The Varatya element, however, merits extended discussion, inasmuch as it ties together many of the apparently obscure themes we have been looking at in the preceding pages. More than this, it offers us a glimpse of what may well have been the earliest and most explicit Indian tradition of the dog man. We have already noted a striking preponderance of canine imagery in the mythology of Indra. In addition to his role in the Vedic myths cited above, it is also Indra who, in the Puranic myths, takes the form of Sunasaka to slay the witch Yatudani, and who seemingly rewards Visvamitra for his sacrifice in the dog cooker village. These latter two myths, like the early Rig Veda reference, are set in a time of cosmic distress, of drought and famine. The Sunasaka myth, moreover, involves the cooking of a human sacrifice, that of Varishi Darby's son, one which is not unlike the near sacrifice of the canine Sunasipa. It also portrays Indra Sunhasaka as extremely healthy and well-fed, by virtue of an alternative form of errant asceticism that he is practicing. The canine elements in these myths of Indra, as well as that of an incongruous ascetic lifestyle, take on a new relief when approached in the light of the Vedic description of the Varatyas, a group generally identified with Indra's and Rudra's troop of Maruts, who are themselves deifications of the wandering wind. Apart from being identified with the Maruts, the Varatyas are also called dogs in the Vedic sources, and it is here that we break through to the most archaic level of Indian dogman traditions. Over the past century, a great deal of Western ink has been spilled, much of it in vain, on the subject of the Varatyas. Until the 1960s, the general consensus had been that the Varatyas were a non-Indo-European, anti-Brahmanic group of antinomian forest-dwelling ascetics, possibly the precursors of the Seva and the Tantric sects. While this interpretation is not without foundation, it is in fact a gloss on an ex post facto Brahmin cover story, which quite succeeded in obscuring the venerable origins of the Varatyas. In 1962, Jan Heisterman suggested in an important article that the Varatyas were in fact an extremely archaic component of Vedic sacrificial society, whose role was gradually phased out with the rise of the Brahmin Varna as a sacrificial specialist. These Varatyas were then degraded in the later literature and cast in an antinomian, anti-Brahmanic mold, were their Satra rites surviving in Vedic initiation rites and in certain periods in the Vrata, or vow of the Brahmacharin, the Vedic student. Falk greatly expands on Heisterman's discussion in a number of ways, the salient points of which we sketch out briefly here. First, the Varatyas were priests who lived and sacrificed as a group or a troop, like the Maruts themselves, taking the sacrificial present, Daksina, for themselves, rather than offering it to a Brahmin technician. One of their number, however, was primus inter pares, and had the task of distributing the sacrifice among the group. Second, the Varatyas performed their rites in the forest, rather than in civilized space of human settlements, and in secret. Their sacrifices were called satras, sittings, as opposed to Brahmanic yajnas. These sacrifices involved bovine or even human victims, and were thereby considered violent. Last and most important for the myths under study here, the Varatyas' sittings took place in the season of Sisira, the dead of winter, the darkest and leanest part of the year, a time when domesticated animals become like wild animals in their skinniness and boniness. These sittings, of either 12 or 61 days in duration, were styled as therapeutic sacrifices. Through the offering of a victim, all of nature, including cattle, humans, and the sun itself, were reinvigorated and made healthy once more. Varatyas are referred to as dogs in a number of passages. The most striking of these is a passage in the Chandogya Upanishad, in which a certain Baka Dalbya chances upon a circle of hungry dogs. The passage is entitled the Samavedic Chant of the Dogs. Then Bakadalbya went out for personal recitation of the Veda. A white dog appeared to him. Other dogs gathered around it. They said, "May you, O Lord, sing to obtain food for us. Truly, we are hungry." He, the white dog, then said to them, "Tomorrow at dawn may you gather around me at this spot." So Bakadalbya kept watch. Then, just as priests here snake along hand in hand while chanting the Bahispava Mana Stotra, even so did they snake along. Then they sat down together and began to pronounce the preliminary vocalizing. They sang, "Om, let us eat. Om, let us drink. Om, may the gods Varuna, Prajapati, and Savitar bring food here. O Lord of food, bring food here. Bring it, Om." Bakadalbya's name recurs in a number of other contexts that connect him with both Varatyas and dogs. These include the Jaiminaya Brahmana, Chagaleya Upanishad, and an important myth in the Kathaka Samhita. In these passages, Bakadalbya is made out to be the Stapati, the leader of a group of Varatyas who are to be identified, according to Falk's thesis, with dogs. A locus for Bakadalbya's Varatya rites is also given in a number of sources. This is the Naimisa, the Twinkling Forest. The Naimisa Forest is also the venue for a number of other obscure myths that bring Varatya dogs into play. One of these is the account of a satra held by the Sunakas, the whelps, in the Naimisa Forest, in the Chagaleya Upanishad. Another is the satra held by Janamejaya in the presence of a certain sage named Sunaka in the Naimisa Forest. This myth serves as the outermost frame of the entire Mahabharata epic. Here, we are told that Janamejaya, the great-grandson of the epic hero Arjuna, is holding a satra in which the sacrificial victims are snakes. In the course of the sacrifice, he asks Sunaka to relate the deeds of his ancestors to him. At about the same moment, a Saramaya, that is, a son of the divine bitch Sarama, approaches the sacrifice. The pup is beaten by 3 of Janamejaya's brothers. Sarama, rightly pointing out that her son had not defiled the sacrifice, since he had averted his gaze so as not to pollute the sacrificial butter, condemns Janamejaya for this gratuitous violence, saying that fear would strike him when he least expected it. The sacrifice is never completed. The satras held by the Varatyas in the Naimisa Forest in the dark dead of winter are portrayed as violent sacrifices in Brahmanic mythology. Thus, the Taittiriya Samhita states, "The daksina of the satra is itself Atman. He who accepts a daksina at a satra eats a corpse, a human corpse, or the corpse of a horse. Food is the cow." The Kathaka Samhita refers to the same practices when it states that one should not sacrifice at a 12-day sacrifice, since such is tantamount to eating human flesh. So it is that, in the satra held in the Naimisa Forest in the Chagaleya Upanishad, the corpse of an officiant named Atreya is present. Elsewhere, the leader of the Varatyas in such a sacrifice is said to substitute the body of a cow for himself. Thus he is eaten without dying himself. Due to a fundamental change in Indian society in the course of the Vedic age, as well as to a gradual movement away from the offering of blood sacrifices, these Varatyas and their secret forest sacrifices become degraded in later literature. This fall from grace is mythologized in a passage from the Pankavimsa Brahmana, through a curse pronounced against them by Varuna. The god-worshipping Varatyas first held a satra with Buddha as their stapati. They consecrated the sacrificial ground without inviting King Varuna. Varuna cursed them. "I cut you off from a share in the sacrifice. You shall not know the way that leads to the gods." At that time, there was neither juice in plants, butter in milk, nor fat in flesh, nor hair on skin, nor leaves on trees. But since the god-worshipping Varatyas performed the 61-day satra, creatures have been endowed with virility and have been full of radiance and vital fluids. This passage, besides explaining the fall of the Varatyas, also delineates the Varatyas' ancient forte. This was to restore the natural world from a state of hunger and diminished strength to new health and vigor through their 12 or 61-day sacrifices. According to Falk, the 12-day sacrifices of the Vedic Varatyas were the ritual cognate of other Indo-European phenomenon, including the Roman Lupercalia and the 12 Nights of Christmas, in which the wild hunter Woden roared through the forests of northern Europe. The wild hunter of the Vedic forest was Rudra, the howler who, like Indra, was the lord of the Maruts, with whom the Varatyas identified themselves. We will return to Rudra Shiva's connections to these dogmen shortly. The 61-day Satra, also performed by the Varatyas, and which took place over the entire period of the season of Sisira, is especially rich in canine allusions. First, there is the duration of the sacrifice itself. In nature, a dog gives birth after 61 days of gestation. This is also the duration of the season of Sisira. Each of the 6 seasons of the Indian year are approximately 60 days in length. The temporal connection is especially important in the case of Sisira, however. This is because the name of the season itself is nearly identical with that of the male hound, who is the divine bitch Sarama's consort, whose name is Sisara. In this light, it is very possible to generate a theory concerning the sacrificial behavior of the Varatya dogs in their 61-day sacrifices in the season of Sisira. First of all, the sacrifice performed was one of a human cow, offered by the dogs in a period of leanness and darkness, a sacrifice that served to revivify and restore nature and the lowering sun. The Varatya's 61-day sacrifice, by which they won the year at a time in which the sun was at its lowest point in its annual celestial movements, and in which human and natural life and vigor were at a low ebb, was nothing less than the birthing of a new year with new life and a rising sun. And because radical problems call for radical solutions, a secret bovine or human blood sacrifice, held in the wild forest by dogs over a canine time frame, bore a logical place in the Varatya's archaic ritual. Ultimately, it was through a ritual canine gestation on the part of a symbolic human dog or group of dogs, nourished on the flesh of a cow, that the year and life came to be renewed in the winter darkness of the wild forest. Here, the Varatya's work was essential to the survival of nature and society. Without their intervention, however terrible, all cows would die, the sun would not make its northward turn, and the universe would fall into chaos. However, with the emergence of a later socio-religious compact between Brahmin sacrificial technicians and royal clients, the Varatyas became marginalized, together with their canine symbolism, to the profit of the Brahmin and his sacred cow. It is in the light of the archaic satras held in the Naimisa forest by the Varatya dogs, who are at once human and canine, and whose victims are thus at once human, canine, and bovine, that many of the myths of the Visvamitra cycle are to be understood. Visvamitra's cooking of a dog in the Svapaka village, the near sacrifice of the canine Sunasipa, Satyavrata's cooking of Vasistha's cow, and perhaps the possessed king Kalmasapada's devouring of Vasistha's sons, all harken back to the practices of the Vedic Varatyas. Indeed, Visvamitra's very nature of being betwixt and between Brahmin and Kshatriya also harkens back to the ambiguous and thereby dangerous status of the Varatyas. However, the myth most open to elucidation through our discussion of the Varatyas is that of Indra Sunasaka. While this myth makes no explicit mention of the Naimisa forest, many of its themes evoke that place of Varatya ritual sacrifice. First of all, this is a period of great penury, a 12-year drought which may be identified with the 12 days of the shorter Satra. The rishis are starving. Indeed, they are so hungry as to have been driven to cook the human body of Prince Saibya Varisha Darbi. Later, when they meet Sunasaka, friend of dogs, and exclaim over his excellent health and his adiposity, each gives a reason for it, a reason that stresses his practice of non-Vedic rites. He does not offer the Agnihotra offering at dawn and dusk. He is not perpetually burdened with their sacred precepts, and so on. Sunasaka, the friend of dogs, i.e. Indra, the leader of the Maruts disguised as a non-Brahmanic sacrificer living in the wild forest, is the sole well-fed creature in a time of general hunger. Moreover, when the rishis are tested by the witch Yatudani, whose own canine connections are numerous, it is Sunasaka alone who is able to answer her riddle, and thus not be struck down by her. A direct and highly meaningful reversal of the lot of the Varatyas in Brahmanic mythology. At the end of this myth, after he has stolen the lotus stalks and parried the Rishi's curse, Indra raises them to heaven, and, presumably, good health, just as the Varatyas did for nature and the lowering sun. Indra Sunasaka thereby stands as a Puranic reference to India's original dogmen, the Varatyas, whose socio-religious status was as lofty as that of the Brahmins once upon a time. 4. Antisocial motion and movements in post-Vedic India. As Indra's importance in the Hindu pantheon waned, his decline became translated into his degradation in epic and Puranic mythology. This is particularly the case with the epic emergence of the myth of Indra's Brahminicide. Here, because he has slain Viratra, and in spite of the fact that doing so constituted a great service to the gods, he is punished for having murdered a Brahmin. It is to this feat that the Aitareya Brahmana refers. And the Mahabharata myth, in which Indra is pursued by an ogress named Brahmahatya, is an elaboration of this statement. Indra is not only degraded in later mythology, at times his place is co-opted, as if by a younger actor, by a less otiose god. This is the case with certain of the myths of Indra's wandering existence that we have reviewed, including that of his Brahminicide. Taking over Indra's role on the heroic level is, as we have shown, the renegade sage Visvamitra. On the divine level, however, his replacement is the enfant terrible. One of his names, Batuka Bhairava, literally means terrible child, of Puranic mythology, Bhairava. Bhairava's mythology is not only that of Indra with a Saivite veneer, it is also the continuation of the original Vedic mythology of Rudra, and a casting into narrative of certain sectarian initiation rites. Moreover, it reflects a Vedic relationship between Indra and Rudra. First, the Maruts and Rudras were nearly identical to one another, as divinizations of such Indo-European confederations as the Varatyas. Second, Indra himself belonged to a general class of Vedic gods known as the Rudras. The Varatyas themselves, as well as the later Orthodox Brahmacarans, who undertook a Varata, a vow, near the time of the winter solstice, clad themselves after the fashion of Rudra, wearing a black hide, turban, uncut hair, etc. When the Varatyas were cast as cow slayers in their satras, they were identified with Rudra Pasupati, who himself afflicted cows with disease and death, unless the Varatyas pacified him with their bovine victims. When the Varatyas slay a cow on Rudra's behalf, they are said to be his dogs or wolves, and lupine and canine symbolism is nearly as abundant in the Vedic Rudra's case as it is in that of Indra. Thus, the Sankhayana Shrauta Sutra compares Bhava and Sarva, the sons of Mahadeva, to snapping wolves who dash all around the wilderness. Dogs and leaders of dogs are extolled together in the Satarudriya hymn. Parallels between the cults of Rudra, the wild hunter of the forest, and those of the Germanic Odin/Woden, as well as the Iranian Asma, and a number of other Indo-European gods associated with the 12 nights of midwinter, are significant here. The mythology of Vedic Rudra bespeaks his fierce and terrible nature. It is said that he is first created from the fierce portions of the gods in order that he may punish the incestuous Prajapati by shooting him with an arrow. In exchange for this feat, the gods make him Pasupati, the lord of creatures. In later traditions, the myth takes the form of Shiva's or his surrogate Virabhadra's destruction of his father-in-law Daksha's sacrifice. In this myth, Shiva's consort Sati, insulted because her husband has not been invited to participate in the rite, burns herself on the sacrificial pyre. After destroying the sacrifice and decapitating Daksa, Shiva wanders the universe, carrying his beloved's corpse over his shoulder. Another variant on the Vedic original is the Lingadbhava manifestation of the phallus myth, in which we find Brahma and Vishnu arguing over who came first. Shiva appears before them, stepping out of the endless linga of light that is his hierophany. He challenges the two to find either an upper or lower end to his linga. Brahma, who flies upward as a swan, falsely claims he has found the top, but in the end, the two are obliged to recognize Shiva's primacy and superiority. The late Puranic myth of Bhairava's Brahmahatya begins on the same note as the Lingadbhava. Brahma and Vishnu, who in his yajna form as the boar who incarnates the sacrifice, are arguing over primacy. Shiva appears in a ball of light. Brahma insults him with his fifth head, calling him Rudra, crybaby. Shiva then creates an enormous black man named Bhairava, whom he orders to cut off Brahma's offending fifth head. This Bhairava does, thus making five-headed Shiva the god with the most heads. And once Shiva revives them, Brahma and Vishnu acknowledge his primacy. Bhairava, however, is left holding Brahma's head. In fact, it will not come loose from his hand. Shiva then instructs him to undertake, for the edification of the universe, a 12-year penance called the Kapalika Vrata, the vow of the skull-bearer. Bhairava, now accompanied by a dog, begins to wander the earth. Because he has killed a Brahmin, he is pursued by the ogress Brahminicide. Wearied by his penance and terrified of this ogress, Bhairava eventually makes his way to Vishnu Loka, where the god Vishnu tells him that he is himself Shiva, and that he need only go to the Tirtha of Kashi, Benares, to stop playing his own game, Leela. Bhairava arrives at the northern edge of Benares, and when he bathes in a tank there, Brahma's skull falls from his hand. He then establishes himself at the place where he was freed from the skull, and becomes the police chief of the city. In Benares alone, Yama, the god of the dead, has no power over those who die. By Shiva's grace, those who die in his holy city attain immediate liberation. It is Bhairava, however, who is the administrator of this unique system. As such, Bhairava is the lord of the Saramayo, the two whelps of Sarama, the dogs of death. Moreover, his vehicle is the dog, and he is sometimes himself attributed canine characteristics. It is not only because he is Yama's replacement that Bhairava is the modern god most closely associated with the dog. This association goes back to the status of his devotees, as well as to the nature of the sect for which his 12-year penance served as the mythological model. The two elements, in fact, go hand in hand. The sects that institutionalized Bhairava in Shaivite Hinduism were generally anti-clerical and anti-caste, if not simply antinomian. They rejected caste distinctions, and some even prohibited Brahmins from their fold. The other side of this egalitarian coin was their elevation of outcasts into authentic devotees of Bhairava. According to the late Sastra literature, Bhairavas are the only temples that may be founded by outcasts. His are also among the very few temples into which outcasts may enter, and the sole temples in which dogs are welcomed and even revered. It is likely that a good number of the members of the tantric sects were themselves outcasts by birth, for this was the way they were depicted in the more orthodox Puranic literature. In this perspective, the description of the Kandala for whom Harishcandra worked, even if he was a Dharma in disguise, made him both a Savara corpseman and a terrible Bhairava skull-bearer. Furthermore, the earliest literary references to Bhairava associate him with the Sabaras. The Sabaras are among the few indigenous peoples in India today for whom the dog plays an auspicious role. Pet dogs, whom they honor as brothers, are given burial rites by the Sabaras. The Ao Nagas, another tribal group, also revere the dog and are the sole people of the subcontinent to have a dog ancestry myth. One cannot discount the possibility that the orthodox association of these peoples with the dog had a certain ethnographic element. The sectarian origins of the cult of Bhairava are more direct and explicit than the ties it may have had with Svapakas or other indigenous peoples. The vow performed by Bhairava during his 12 years of wandering was called the Kapalika Vrata. In fact, there is a terrible Shaivite sect of the medieval period who called themselves the Kapalikas. Their supreme god was Bhairava, and their initiation followed that god's mythic model. The first reference to the Kapalika Vrata actually predates both the formation of the Kapalika order and the Puranic Bhairava myths. This is the Yajnavalkya Smriti, a 2nd to 4th century text in which the penances to be undergone by one who has killed a Brahmin are legalistically described. He is to wander about for 12 years, staying at no place for more than 5 nights, carrying his victim's skull as his begging bowl and proclaiming his crime. A source contemporary with the Yajnavalkya Smriti is the Epastamba Dharma Sutra, which states, "The slayer of a learned Brahmin or fetus, having put on the skin of a dog or the skin of a donkey with the fur facing outwards, carries the man's skull for drinking." What made the Kapalikas different from those who would have performed the penance described in the Yajnavalkya Smriti and elsewhere was that these iconoclasts purposely murdered a Brahmin in order to have his head, performed their 12-year initiation, and then continued to eat and drink from his skull. The notorious activities of these, the Hells Angels of medieval India, are chronicled in a great number of sectarian and literary sources, including the 7th century South Indian Mata Vilasa, in which a madman returns to a Kapalika his missing skull bowl, saying he had taken it from a most respectable dog belonging to a Kandala. It is highly probable that the Kapalikas were responsible for this insertion of Bhairava's passion into the various Puranas in which it is presently found. They were, however, not alone in this work of sabotaging other sects' canonical texts for their own purposes. They were following the lead of at least one earlier Shaivite sect, the Pasupatas, followers of Rudra Shiva in his Pasupati, Lord of Creatures, form. It is possible that this latter sect had historical ties with the Cynics, the canines of Diogenes Laertes. There are striking similarities in the practices of the two, and both were centered in port cities, Sinope on the Black Sea and Broch on the Arabian Sea, that had trade relations in the first centuries of the Common Era. For the past 800 years, there has existed a cult of Shiva in Ujjain, an important stronghold of the Bhairava cult since at least the 12th century. This cult, first attested to in the 12th century Shankara Vijaya, is unusual inasmuch as devotion takes the form of synanthropism. At the Malari temple there, devotees behave like dogs in every respect, barking and eating off the ground. The Malari cult remains strong in many parts of the Deccan, especially in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh. In it, one may glimpse survivals both of the Pasupata tradition of feigned madness and dissimulation, and, going even further back, of the Varatyas of Vedic tradition. Malari himself closely identified with Martanda Bhairava, who was accompanied in legend by 700 dogs. These dogs are his devotees, who were first transformed by Malari Martanda Bhairava from tigers to humans, and then instructed by him to behave like dogs. On the 9th day of the Dasahara festival, the Vigayas, the tiger dogs of Bhairava, commemorate this mythic event by which they helped Bhairava to defeat Malla, when they act and bark like dogs when pilgrims arrive. Formerly, they would run their begging bowls, would howl and bark and quarrel amongst each other, and lie flat on the floor to eat like dogs. If food is offered into the bowls, they will fight like dogs, trying to tear food from each other's mouth. According to Falk, the Malari's dogmen are to be placed in direct correspondence to the Varatyas of the Vedic period, with the 10 days of the Dogmen's festival corresponding to the 10 days that in fact constituted the 12 nights of the Varatyas' Devadasaha Satra. In this perspective, Bhairava Malari's slaying of Malla on the 10th night of Dasahara parallels the human sacrifice that ended the Varatyas' Satra. So it is that the pedigree of the Tantric Bhairava's dogmen devotees is as venerable as that of the Brahmin orthodoxy from which they generally distance themselves, extending back to Rudra's Varatyas, the dogmen of the Vedic age. In India, following the Pasupatas and the Kapalikas, the Nath Siddhas, Dattatreans and Aghoris, all medieval Shaivite sects, spread the cult of Bhairava wherever they went. In this way, Bhairava's tantric cult was spread over the Deccan Plateau, northern and western India, Bengal, and Nepal. In Nepal, Bhairava continues to be highly important to Buddhist divinity. The Naths do not seem to emphasize Bhairava's canine connections, as none of the Himalayan Bhairava temples that they established show him with his canine vehicle. However, in Nepali tradition relates that Bhairava, having taken the form of a dog, barked "boo," by which Bungagayan was recognized to be the birthplace of the Matsyendranath, the great Nath guru and patron deity of the Kathmandu Valley. Also in Nepal, the dog is one of the 4 creatures revered with flower garlands, sweetmeats, and unguents at the annual Tihar festival. In certain North Indian folk rites of exorcism and the like, Bhairava, when called upon, appears in the form of a black dog. The Vedic Indra and Yama and the Shaivite Bhairava aside, Dattatreya, a Shiva-Vishnu hybrid when he is depicted as a god, is the only Hindu divinity closely associated with dogs. In his iconography, he is, in fact, surrounded by 4 dogs. These are styled as the 4 Vedas, or the 4 human appetites, both of which the guru god Dattatreya mastered. Dattatreya's cult is centered in Maharashtra, where later saints such as Eknath and Tukaram, traditionally initiated by Dattatreya, are also associated with dogs. In a hagiographic source, the 14th to 15th century Shankara Digivijaya of Madhvacarya, Shiva is portrayed after the same fashion as Dattatreya. Here, the orthodox scholar saint meets on a narrow path a Svapaka accompanied by 4 dogs. He orders the outcast to give way to him, at which point the Svapaka launches into a philosophical discourse, reminiscent of Krishna's Bhagavad Gita teaching on identity and difference. Shankara acknowledges his error, whereupon the Svapaka reveals himself to be Shiva, surrounded by the 4 Vedas. Another account, also found in the Shankara Digivijaya, turns this encounter into an armed sectarian confrontation. Here, a Kapalika named Ugra Bhairava nearly wins the philosophical argument by cutting off Shankara's head. But in the end, he loses his own life at the claws of Shankara's disciple, Padmapada, in whom the man-lion, Narasimha, has taken a timely incarnation. A later Nath version of the same legend, found in a 17th century compilation, transforms the Kapalika Ugra Bhairava into an incarnation of Bhairava himself. The dread god cuts off the heads of Shankara and 4 of his disciples, but later restores them, after which true detachment arose. 5. Purity and polarity, radical problems and solutions. Leaving Shaivite traditions of wandering ascetics behind, we will close this discussion of unordered or antinomian movement and space with the didactic myth of a Brahmin who dreamed he was an outcast and a king, found his dream to be confirmed by other people's testimony, and then yearned from Vishnu that consensus does not verity make. This is the Yoga Vasistha myth of Gadi, which is evocative in at least 2 ways. First, we have already seen, in the Hariskandra myth, the theme of a person becoming a dog cooker in a dream. And second, Gadi is one of the patronymics of Visvamitra. In fact, one sees much of the renegade sage Visvamitra in the Gadi of this quite orthodox Vaishnava text. By performing strict austerities, the Brahmin Gadi obtains a boon from Vishnu. He asks that Vishnu explain Maya, illusion, to him. Sometime later, while plunging himself into the water of a pond, he has a vision of his own death and cremation. He then sees himself reborn out of the stinking womb of a Svapaka woman. He then grows up as a Svapaka named Katanja, who lives in squalor and who hunts with dogs. He marries a Svapaki and has children by her. A terrible drought arises, during which his family dies. He begins to wander through other lands. There, in a country called Kira, Kashmir, he comes into a royal capital where the king has just died. Upon his arrival, an omen is fulfilled by which he is named king of the country. He rules there under the name of Gavala for 8 years, with no one knowing that he is a Svapaka, until a fellow outcast from his old village chances into his capital and recognizes him, saying, "Bo Katanja." When the word of Gavala's true identity spreads in Kira, it is, for the royal household and ministers, as if a corpse had been staying in their home. They run, as if from a Rakshasa, and plunge themselves into a pool of fire. His kingdom now reduced to a state of non-time at the end of a cosmic aeon. Gavala too throws himself into the fire, and awakens from the fire into the water of the pond into which he had plunged as the Brahmin Gadi. Some time later, Gadi receives a visitor who relates an account he had heard of an untouchable who had ruled for 8 years in the northern regions before being unmasked. The perplexed Gadi begins a period of wandering to find out about himself. He finds the village in which he had been Katanja, a truly ghoulish place, in which the people smear the bones of the dead of whose bodies they dispose with bitch's blood and yellow coloring, wearing these as ornaments while they sing and dance on the cremation grounds. Leaving this land of ghoulish creatures behind, he comes to the paradisical Himalayas and the land of Kira, where he learns that he had ruled there as Gavala, who had committed suicide with most of his entourage 12 years previously. After some time, Vishnu comes to explain to him that his own and the Svapakas and the Kira people's experience of him as Katanja and Gavala were all illusory. The doomsday imagery of the Bhuta Mandala, as well as of the Kira Holocaust, are reminiscent of the apocalyptic settings of the myths of Visvamitra in the Svapaka village and Harischandra on the Benares cremation grounds. The comparison of a Svapaka in the royal household to a corpse further evokes the death or doomsday imagery of the myths of the dog cookers. It also broaches the problem of implicit and explicit purity codes and violations vis-a-vis the outcasts. We have already seen concern for purity shown in the dog cooker's admonition that Visvamitra not eat dog meat, in Indra's horror at seeing the dog cooker Trisanku elevated to heaven in his polluting body, and in the language of certain of the curses and counter-curses of the Visvamitra cycle. Kings, outcasts, dogs, untouchables, and the question of purity are brought together in a particularly surrealist account in Kalana's 12th century Rajataramgini, the Chronicle of the Kings of Kashmir. In the 5th book of this, the only surviving historical chronicle of India, we find a Romanesque account of the reign and fall of King Kakravarman, who ruled in AD 936-37. After winning his throne through a series of alliances and decisive battles, Kakravarman becomes debauched by a pair of Svapaki or Dombi dancing girls. They quickly render the king their sexual plaything, while they and their family take over the royal court. Svapaka ministers will only appoint to royal office those nobles who will eat the leavings from the Svapaki courtesans' plates. These same ministers delight in wearing the Svapaki's menses-stained undergarments in court. Instead of noble Sanskrit, they speak their own base dialect. They enter and so defile temples reserved for the higher castes. Kakravarman commits a series of outrages of his own, in addition to shacking up with outcast strumpets. He violates a fasting Brahmin woman, builds a monastery for a tantric sect, and treacherously slays certain of his allies. His betrayed allies turn against him. One night, while Kakravarman is relieving himself in the Svapaka toilet, assassins set upon him. They stab him to death in his lover's impure arms and crush his knees with stones. The story ends thus. In the night, that king, who had been consumed by Svapakas, was killed by those murderers like a dog in its own shit. Kakravarman, who through his sexual relations with domineering outcast women has himself become stained with their sin, is in the end reduced to the state of a dog. This is reminiscent, but on a much stronger register, of the crimes of Trisanku and Hariskandra, who are reduced to the station of Svapakas for their sins. There is, however, an emphasis in the Kakravarman account that, while present in other accounts of Svapakas, is not so strongly stressed in them. This is the important notion of purity and bodily contact. It should be noted that all of Kakravarman's and the Svapakis' abominations involve bodily fluids. In their union with the king, it is the mingling of sexual fluids that runs counter to nature. In the court, it is the saliva on the leavings of their food that violates the purity of the nobles forced to eat such horrors. The menstrual blood worn into court by the Svapaka ministers is so powerful and polluting as to stain the entire kingdom. It is the same power inherent to a Dambi's uterine blood that was so highly prized by the Tantrics, who were also recipients of Kakravarman's misguided largesse. We find similar language in the myth of Gadi Katanja Gavala. When it is discovered that an outcast has been ruling the kingdom for 8 years, it is as if a corpse had been staying in the people's homes. The only solution is dissolution. Were they to go on living, they too would be outcasts, condemned to several base rebirths. Again, Hariskandra, by doing the work of an outcast as he disposes of the dead in Benares, where the present-day cremation monopoly is run by a Damraj, he himself becomes a Svapaka, as does Trisanku in the forest. In the Brihat Samhita's treatment of omens, it is the contact of an outcast dog's urine with the body of a Brahmin cow that portends the most evil of fates. In the same vein, the post-Upanishadic cliché, as disgusting as a sacrificial vessel that has been licked by a dog, reflects the danger of mixing polar opposites on the level of bodily excretions. Here, the cow's milk or clarified butter would be brought into contact with the canine saliva. In yogic traditions, the mechanism of skin contact as source of pollution is emphasized as well. The thousands of pores that cover the body must be purged regularly through yogic purification techniques. Ultimately, and on a more immediate level than the creation myths of the outcast races we reviewed above, it is such notions and categories of purity that highlight and define the polarities of high-caste Brahmins versus casteless dog cookers in Hindu society. So it is that we find the legal texts spelling out the ideology of purity categories, as well as of the theoretical inviolability of the Brahmin's body vis-a-vis other humans in very clear terms. Thus we read in Manu, when he has had contact with a Kandala, a menstruating woman, an outcast, a woman in childbed, a corpse, or one who has touched a corpse, a Brahmin becomes pure by bathing. Water, the universal solvent, except in extreme cases where dissolution through fire proves necessary, cleanses away the stain inherent to the body, if not the ontological being of the outcast who has come into contact with the person of a twice-born. There are at least 2 features inherent to this concept of bodily purity and pollution. As far as the outcast is concerned, polluted existence is a vicious circle indeed. Because of a dangerous and sinful mixing of sexual fluids, and thus of social categories on the part of a parent or ancestor, he is condemned to birth in a body that is, a priori, polluted and polluting. As if this were not enough, his caste occupations condemn him to dwell in sin as well, working as he does, killing creatures, flaying and dressing them out, or disposing of their mortal remains and waste products. But, of course, he is bound to engage in such occupations because he is the product of sin in the first place. His prohibition from social intercourse with the twice-born is a result of a violation of the same order by one of his forebears. One can understand the modern term untouchable in this light, even if its historical pedigree is a relatively short one. Yet the manipulation of polluting substances is the outcast's svadharma, his place in the moral and social order from which he is de facto excluded. It is the Brahmin who is most vulnerable to the dog cooker's pollution in the social intercourse that he might have with the latter in the execution of their respective social duties. Manu waffles on whether or not Brahmins could eat meat, an indication that changes in this and other purity codes were in progress at the beginning of the Common Era. The root of this change lies mainly in the fact that even while they rejected the renunciate ideology as antisocial, the Brahmins were in the process of co-opting many of its elements as means to maintaining a social and ethical distance from which to exert their authority. This was particularly the case with the purity codes, and the concomitant result of the exclusion of polluting dog cookers from the lower end of the social pyramid was the self-exclusion of the pure, milk-drinking Brahmin from the upper end. This polarization is described in Manu in highly legalistic and mechanistic terms. A Kandala, a village pig, a cock, a dog, a menstruating woman, and a eunuch must not look at Brahmins while they eat. Whatever any of these sees at a burnt oblation, at the giving of a gift, at a dinner given to Brahmins, or at any rite in honor of the gods or ancestors, will not produce the intended result. A boar makes the rite useless by inhaling the smell of the offerings, a cock by the air of its wings, a dog by casting his eye on them, a low-caste man by touching them. This same polarity is cast in narrative form in the Puranic myth of an evil king named Vina, whose name is also that of an outcast people, out of whose dead body the rishis churn out both the good and evil internal to him. From his left thigh arises a black Nisada outcast. From the right, the pure and virtuous king, Prathu. In one variant of this myth, a living Vina is made pure when the impure Nisada is churned out of him. This cleansing away of the outcast in him is his redemption. In the later literature of the Puranas in particular, we find that the spirit of the devotional religion of love, bhakti, offers easy purification solutions not only to evil kings, but also to the lowest of the low, the dog cooker. Some texts go so far as to say that in the Kali Yuga, a dog cooker who is devoted to a given god merits liberation more than does the Brahmin non-devotee. It is in this context that we find parallels to the happy endings of the myths of Sunasipa, Trisanku, and Hariskandra, endings rendered all the more baroque by the sectarian biases that pervade the Puranic accounts. So, in the Vamana Samhita version of the Vina myth, that evil king comes to be reborn and, thirsting for liberation, lives in the precincts of the Shaivite Sthanu Tirtha on the Sarasvati River, whose waters are nevertheless prohibited to him. By chance, a dog who has swum there sprays Vina with the Tirtha's waters when he shakes himself off. Through the agency of the dog, and especially the purifying waters that dissolve all stain, Vina is cleansed. Shiva then offers him a boon, and Vina requests that the dog be allowed to accede to Shiva Loka. This request is granted, and Vina is himself later wholly purified when, reborn as Andaka, he has his sin burned away by Shiva, who burns him up. In fact, all of the epic and Puranic myths involving the redemption, elevation, or salvation of a dog or svapaka are set either at a tirtha or around a linga. In some, there recurs the anti-Brahmanic or antinomian sentiment that, first evinced in the Visvamitra cycle, takes its most extreme form in the Bhairava myths. So, in the Ramayana, a dog pleads to Rama that he has been unjustly struck on the head by a Brahmin who had ordered him to yield to him on the street. When Rama argues that a Brahmin is legally exempt from punishment, the dog replies that it had been his wish to pardon the Brahmin and request a boon for him in any case. The boon that the Brahmin may be made head of a certain Kalanjana monastery is granted, after which the dog cryptically predicts that the Brahmin will, in the fullness of time, go on to hell by abusing his position. The lustrous dog then returned to the place from whence it had come. Having been high-minded in his previous births, it had fallen into a polluted state in that existence. It then undertook an expiation in Benares. Shaivite myths of this sort, especially those found in the Skanda Purana, generally have a greater air of serendipity to them. A certain king of the outcast Karatas had been a dog in a previous birth. Fortuitously, on the night of Shiva's greatest festival, the Mahashivaratri, he had circumambulated a Shiva temple while running from some pursuers. Praised be Shiva, the dog was killed next to the temple's entrance. By virtue of this happy spatio-temporal coincidence, he is reborn into the Karata royal family. Because of his canine background, however, the Karata king is evil and uncontrolled in his passions, even in his present birth. He and his queen are instructed that, by worshipping Shiva on Mahashivaratri, they might both accede to the station of Shiva after 7 further rebirths. In the 6th to 10th century Vaishnavite Bhagavata Purana, the message is no less radical than that of the Shaivites. Even if bathing at the Tirtha occurs on a symbolic level, by bathing, through the hearing of Hari's stainless eternal fame, the entire world, beginning with the Svapaka, is immediately purified. Even a Svapaka becomes fit for a Soma festival, through devotion to God. The crowning reversal of Brahmanic purity codes is to be found in the 5 tantric anti-sacraments, the Pancha Makara, or 5 M's. Clearly a heterodox subversion of the Pancha Gavya, the 5 pure products of the Brahmin's cow. The Pancha Makara consists of the use of flesh, fish, wine, parched grain, and sexual intercourse as means to the supernatural powers or siddhis and bodily liberation so prized by the tantrics. In the practice of this final anti-sacrament, the outcast Dambi or Svapaki is most prized as a sexual partner, in part due to the energy latent in her uterine blood. The reversal of pure and polluting between what a Brahmin drinks and what an outcast woman secretes could not be more explicit here. The Buddhist tradition, contemporaneous with and generally contemptuous of that of Hindu bhakti, ridiculed Hindus as Tirthikas, knee-jerk pilgrims. It thus chose for its hyperbolic representation of the Tirtha ideology the example of a dog swimming in the Ganges, who nevertheless is not considered pure. The Buddhism of this period nevertheless did share the anti-orthodox spirit of Hindu bhakti. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the 8th to 10th century Karyapada songs. Outside the city, O Dambi, is your cottage. Go there touching only the Brahmins and the shaven-headed. While a probable reference to the movement of vital energy in the yogin's body, the Dambi here is also an outcast woman whose touch would be abhorrent to both Brahmins and Buddhist monks. It is possible to see a parallel evolution of Buddhist and Hindu attitudes toward outcasts in references to both kandalas and dogs. In reality, the Buddhist faith, which undoubtedly attracted outcasts into its folds with its original ethical rejection of the system of castes and other Brahmanic abuses, came to share the Hindu ideology that excluded the outcast from society. This was the case at least until the period that saw the emergence of bhakti in the Hindu tradition. Then a revision of the old ideology followed that paralleled that of the Hindus. So we find, in some of the later Jatakas, the promise of nirvana offered to Kandalas and Pukasas. In another Jataka, a Kandala who has become a bodhisattva, teacher of the Dhamma, even kicks his Brahmin pupils. An apparent parallel to the Hindu valorization of the ascetic life over worldly activity may be found in the Kukuru Jataka, the dog birth. Here, the Buddha takes birth as a cemetery dog in order to give ethical instruction to his disciple Ananda, who has himself taken birth as the king of Benares. The narrative ends with the king being shown by the dog bodhisattva that his own royal hounds had perpetrated a crime for which the cemetery dogs had been blamed and put to death. The king becomes a benefactor of dogs. This analogical tendency is carried to its limit in the person of Kuruvaraja, a saint of the Tantric Buddhist tradition to which the Karyapadas belonged. Kuruvaraja, whose name means king of the dogs, lived with a yogini who looked like a bitch. By day, he preached in the guise of a dog to 1,000 viras and yoginis. By night, he would go to the cremation ground to observe the esoteric rites.